When managing web applications, one of our biggest concerns is the URLs and addresses that our users are going to use to connect to these web applications. We may need to add in multiple addresses that our users could use to connect to our applications. We may need to go in and modify the different starting points for site collections, or we may even want the ability to set up our site collections to have a host name for themselves. And that's exactly what we want to take a look at in this lesson. We're going to start off by taking a look at our managed paths. A managed path is a container that's going to become the starting point for the URLs, for our top sites, or for our site collections. When I create a child site, that child site is going to become, well, a child of the parent. Thus, the URL structure is going to follow right along. So I'm just simply going to have maybe regions/California/San Diego. And so when I go to create that San Diego site, I don't actually get to determine anything else above it. All of that structure is there. I just simply call it San Diego, and we move on from there. But when I go to create a site collection, remember that there's no hierarchy with site collections. We need somewhere that we can place them into. We need a starting point. And that's what our managed paths do for us, is they give us starting points for the addresses for our site collections. We have two available types of managed paths: explicit and wildcard. With an explicit managed path, what's going to happen is that subfolder name that we create becomes the available name for the site collection. So if I created an explicit path and I called it search, then I could place a site collection at that location, and it would then be, let's say for example, http://intranet.geektrainer.com/search. On the flip side, our wildcard becomes a folder from which I actually get to then choose the name of the top site or of the site collection. So if I created a managed path and I called it departments and I made it wildcard, then what would happen is we'd be able to then create separate site collections and give them a name. So I'd be able to create one, call it IT, call it sales, call it HR, call it whatever it is that I might need. Now to create a managed path, as always, we've got two options: central administration and PowerShell. In central administration, this is going to be done by going to Application Management, Manage Web Applications, choosing the web application, clicking on Manage Paths, and then making the appropriate modifications inside of there. On the flip side, if I want to do this in PowerShell, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify new SP Managed Path with the URL that I want to use, the web application that I want to associate this with, and then by default it's going to be wildcard. If I want it to be explicit, then I provide the explicit switch. Let's take a look at how to create an explicit path from PowerShell, a wildcard path from central administration, and then the impact that that's going to have on our ability to create site collections. I'm going to start off by going to the Start menu, and I'm going to bring up the management shell here. And the command that I want is new SP managed path, just a little bit of tab action there. I'm going to give this a name, and let's go ahead and call this search. The web application that I want, and this is going to be http://intranet 2013 geektrainer.com, and I want this to be explicit. I'm going to hit enter, and just like that, it's now created that new managed path for me. I'm going to go back to the Start menu, and then I'm going to open up Central Administration. And now I'm going to click Manage Web Applications. I'm going to choose my intranet, and then right up here you're going to notice that there is my Managed Paths. There's our search that we created earlier, and now I'm going to add in a brand new one. I'm going to call it Departments. I'm going to click Add Path. You'll notice it's wildcard inclusion. If I wanted it to be explicit, I could drop it down and choose explicit. In my case, I want that to be wildcard, so I'm going to click Add, and now that's been created. I'm going to click OK, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Application Management here, and I'm going to click Create Site Collections. Now, if you haven't already seen how to create site collections, again, don't worry too much about it. My main goal here is really just to show you the impact that this is going to have. Over on the website address, you'll notice that if I drop this down and I choose Search, that the text box goes away. The reason is that this is an explicit path, meaning that I'm able to put a site collection at the search location, but that's it. All the children off of there would just simply be sites. But if I drop this back down again and I choose Departments, now what you're going to notice is that I get a name over here. So now I could type in, for example, Sales, and now I'd be able to create a site collection located at intranet2013.geektrainer.com/departments/sales. So my wildcard give me the ability to provide a child name. The explicit means that it's specifically going to be that option and only that option. Now, having the ability to access a site collection as a subfolder off of some main URL can be advantageous. That what I could do is I could type in http:// whatever my intranet URL happens to be, /sales, /IT, /human resources. But sometimes the desired effect that I'm looking for is I'm looking to have a URL, a brand new host name, point to a site collection. So I'd like to be able to say sales.geektrainer.com and have that point to a site collection. So that way I can add in a brand new host header name, but I don't have to create a brand new web application for it. That is exactly what host header site collections are all about. That they allow me to create site collections with their own unique host header names. Now, there are a couple of little catches here that we need to be aware of. The first of which is that host header site collections are not able to take advantage of alternate access mappings, which is a feature we're going to talk about a little bit later in this lesson. The next big thing about our host header site collections is that they have to be created through PowerShell. Now, in order for me to create a host header site collection, there's effectively going to be 4 steps. I need to create the containing web application that's going to host all those site collections. I need to set up the site collection itself, and I'm going to have to do that through PowerShell. And then I also need to update both DNS with the new record, and I need to add a binding into IIS. Because that binding in IIS is what's actually going to inform IIS that this is an available URL. Without adding in the binding, the request is going to come in, IIS is going to look at that and go, well, I don't know who you're looking for, and reject it. And unfortunately, the PowerShell does not automatically add in the binding for me. However, as we're going to see, through PowerShell, I could go in and set up that binding. For my demo environment, I've already got the web application created. Actually created this in a prior lesson. The name of it is SharePoint Header Host Web Application, and it's available at that URL. There is nothing special at all about that web application. It's just a normal web application. I've also already added in the DNS entry at sales.geektrainer.com. So the only two things that I'm going to have to do for my demo is simply create the host header, site collection, and add the binding into IIS. I'm going to bring up my Start menu, and I'm going to bring up the PowerShell integrated scripting environment. And then from inside of here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a script that I've already created, my little host header site collection script. Hit open, and what you're going to notice up at the very top is that I'm once again loading in the PowerShell snap-in. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a brand new site collection by calling new SP site. Now the real key to this PowerShell call is not the name, the owner alias, or the template. That's just generic site collection stuff. The real key is the host header web application. That's where I'm going to tell this that I want this to be available as a host header inside of that web application. You're also going to notice when I call new SP site that instead of just giving it a generic name or something like that, then I'm punching in the full URL that I want this to be available at, and you'll notice that the URL is http://sales.geektrainer.com. So this site collection, when created, is not going to be available on a managed path. It's not going to be at hostheader.com or .geektrainer.com/sales. It's going to be available at sales.geektrainer.com. You'll also notice down below that I've got a little bit of PowerShell for IIS as well. What that will do for me is that will find the SharePoint host header web application website inside of IIS, and it will add in my new binding with the wildcard for the IP address, a port of 80, and then the host header of sales.geektrainer.com. And this is once again the advantage of using PowerShell, is that I can now do this in one fell swoop without me going in and manually creating that little binding as a separate step. So let me run my script here, and what you're going to notice after just a couple of moments here is that it's now created my site collection. So now how can we see this in action? Well, I'm going to start off by going back to Central Administration. And from inside of Central Administration, I'm going to go to Application Management, and I'm going to go to View All Site Collections. Now you'll notice the web application that's chosen up at the top right there, and that is my host header.geektrainer.com. And then down below you're going to notice the URL, and over on the the left-hand side, you're also going to notice my sales.geektrainer.com. And if I click that to select it, it's already selected, that's why it's bold. It would then refresh to the right side, and what that's telling me is that the URL is not on a managed path, it's on http://sales.geektrainer.com. And so now what I can do is I could open up a brand new tab, type in sales.geektrainer.com, hit enter, and then if we give this just a moment here, what we're going to notice is that we'll get that team site collection that we just created from PowerShell, and that's now available at sales.geektrainer.com. And there is that site collection that we created that's now available on a host header. Now let's close off the address management lesson here by talking about alternate access mappings. What alternate access mappings allow me to do is they allow me to add additional URLs that a web application is able to respond to. Now, the first main reason that I might just simply want to add in additional URLs is if I happen to be maybe migrating from 2007 into 2010, and the names are going to wind up changing. Maybe I'm just needing to restructure things, so I'm having to change the names because of that. Or it could be a scenario where I just simply want to be able to add in maybe a couple of different shortcuts. So maybe instead of typing out, for example, centraladministration.geektrainer.com, what you could type out is maybe ca.geektrainer.com. Now, the other very big thing that alternate access mappings allow me to do is they allow me to create what are known as zones. Each zone will then have a particular URL that it's associated with. And then when you come in through that zone, I can actually modify the permissions. So I can make it so that if you come in from an internal URL, that you're going to have full capabilities to be able to go in and actually do editing. But if you come in from an external URL, that you would only have read-only access. So when I configure, for example, crawling, one of the things that I might do is I might configure the crawler to go access a read-only URL, but allow everybody else, of course, to go access the normal URL. Now, when we go in to create our alternate access mappings, we're going to create our zones. Our zones are containers for alternate access mappings. They do not configure security. The names to the zones are just simply there for grouping purposes. Now, one of the things that tends to throw people is you're going to notice that there's names like intranet and extranet. And people will look at that and they'll automatically make the assumption of, oh, that must be setting up default permissions. It's actually not. The names are 100% arbitrary. They're just simply there for grouping purposes. So that way later on, if I go to set permissions on a zone, I'm going to choose one of the zones, and I change the permissions. So obviously, if I am going to have something that's going to be, external facing, then I might want to choose an external sounding name. But the permissions in and of themselves are not going to be set up by default. The zones that we have available to us are default, intranet, internet, extranet, and then custom. And again, they don't make any difference whatsoever. The big thing is, of course, that the default, well, that's the one that has to be provided. All the other ones are optional. Each zone is going to have one public URL. And that's going to be the main URL that I want people to use when they access that web application through that particular zone. But I can also add in one or more internal URLs. Now, with the internal URLs, SharePoint will still respond on them, but you'll notice in the address bar that your URL will be rewritten to the public URL. So each zone, one public, that's the one that I want people to use, can have multiple internal. SharePoint will respond to them, but it will automatically rewrite them to that one public URL that I set up. Now, to set up my alternate access mapping, you're going to notice that the steps are very similar to setting up a host header. Now, what I need to do is I need to create the entry inside of DNS. I need to update the IIS bindings. And then what I need to do is add in the access mapping by going into Central Administration, Application Management, and then Configure Alternate Access Mappings, or I need to, through PowerShell, call the new SP alternate URL commandlet. And off of there, the parameters that I'm going to have are the URL, the zone, the web application, and whether or not I want it to be internal. And by the way, the default is public. What I want to do for my demo is I want to take a look at how we could manage the URL that Central Administration is going to be exposed out on. That maybe what I want is I want centraladmin.geektrainer.com to be the URL for Central Administration. So let's start off by doing step 1, which is updating DNS. So I'm going to hit Start and DNS, and I've got the DNS management tool installed on my SharePoint server. You're typically going to need that. You may as well just go ahead and skip to the end there. And I'm going to go under Geek Trainer, and I'm going to add in a brand new A record. I'm going to give this a name of Central Admin, and then the IP address of my system, which is 192.168.42.2. And I'm going to hit Add Host, and I'm going to hit OK. Cool. Now, I'm going to go back to my Start menu, and I'm going to go to Central Administration. And now, I'm going to go to Application Management, and I'm going to go to Configure Alternate Access Mappings. And now what I want to do is I want to edit the public URL. This is the main one that everybody is going to be connecting to for Central Administration. So I'm going to hit my little drop down. I'm going to say Change Alternate Access Mapping, and I'm going to choose my Central Administration site. And I'm going to update this. I'm going to keep it on the same port number, but I'm going to update this to now be centraladmin.geektrainer.com. And I'm going to click Save. And so now that's available on centraladmin.geektrainer.com:4242. But of course, it's not going to work yet. The reason that it's not going to work is because I haven't yet added in the binding in IIS. So back to the Start menu. We'll fire up the IIS management tool. And if I go under my sites here, what I'm going to see is my SharePoint Central Administration. Over here on the far right side is my bindings. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that little entry there, and you'll notice that there's no host name, just simply a port number. I'm going to go in and change this. So I'm going to say Edit, and I'm going to set this to be centraladmin.geektrainer.com, and I'm going to click OK. And now that's entered in for my Central Admin site. Let me go ahead and add in another one here. Again on port 4242. This is going to be SharePoint 2013.geektrainer.com. And I'm going to hit OK. And now, just going to expand that out. So those are the two bindings, the two host names that this website, in turn web application, in turn Central Administration, could now respond to. But the only one that we've actually told SharePoint about is just the Central Admin one. So I'm going to hit Close here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my browser. I'm going to open up a brand new tab and let's test it out. So http://centraladmin.geektrainer.com:4242. Hit enter. And sure enough, you're going to notice that it's now working on Central Admin. If I come back over here to my other tab, and I say http://SharePoint 2013 geektrainer.com:4242, and I hit enter, you're going to notice that it's still routing me over to Central Administration because of the fact that IIS is still accepting that URL for that website, and thus in turn that web application, and thus in turn Central Administration. But the big thing that I want you to notice is the URL. That the URL still says SharePoint 2013. That's not the URL that I want people using. I want people using Central Admin. This is yet again where alternate access mappings come into play. Now we've already seen how to do it inside of Central Administration. Let's close this demo and fix that by going into PowerShell. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Start. So we'll open up the management shell, cd / and CLS. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say new SP alternate URL. And I'm going to specify the new name of http://SharePoint 2013 geektrainer.com:4242. And I'm just going to hit space a few times just to put that out to the next line. And I'm going to say web application. And this will be http://centraladmin.geektrainer.com:4242. And my zone is going to be the default zone. And then finally, I want this to be an internal name. Now remember that what an internal name means is that this is going to still respond to requests, but it's going to update the URL in the browser to be the public one, to be the one that I really want my users to use. So let me hit enter here. Sure enough, that was now created. Now let's test this. I'm going to go back to Internet Explorer here. I'm going to close out the little tab because I have to actually open up a brand new one. And I'm going to type in SharePoint 2013.geektrainer.com:4242. I'm going to hit enter, and what you're going to notice in the URL field is that the URL field is now set to centraladmin.geektrainer.com:4242. The reason for that is when I go in to App Management and I go in to configure alternate access mappings, that you'll notice that we now have our entry for Central Admin and our entry for SharePoint 2013. You'll notice the public URL for both of those is centraladmin.geektrainer.com:4242. So now it's going to rewrite any of the default URLs for Central Administration to now be Central Admin. Now as a real quick side note on zones, and we get more into this when we get into security later on, but I'm going to go back to Application Management, and I'm going to go to Manage Web Applications. And I'm going to click on really any one of these. I'm going to choose the host header one. And when I click on the user policy here, what you're going to notice is if I say add users, what this will do is this will ask me what zone it is that I want. That little user policy tab allows me to change the policy and actually override any applied permissions to that web application based on where you're coming from. So if you come in from one of the extranet URLs and I want to limit your access, then that is how I can do it. There is how we can manage our addresses in our web applications. I'll see you in the next lesson.